It is Friday, January 17th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Nintendo Switch 2 episode of LTPS. We've got a lot going on this past week in the PlayStation landscape, so let's begin, as always, with our PS Plus reminder. Make sure you claim your January PS Plus Essential Games before they go away. Also, this coming Tuesday, on the 21st, we have the PS Plus Extra and Premium lineup going live on PSN as well. And for Extra, we only have 9 games. I think that is one of the lowest amounts we've had since the relaunch, but we do have some big heavy hitters in there, that being God of War Ragnarok. So 2 years after launch, the game is now going into Extra. And then you've got Like a Dragon, The Man Who Erased His Name, Atlas Fallen, SD Gundam Battle Alliance. You've got Sayonara Wild Hearts on there, Anno, a lot of pretty big heavy hitters. And then going into PS Plus Premium, only 2 games, but we do have Medieval 2 on PS1. And then, funny enough, Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings PS2, which it's funny because, like, we saw so many Disney, LucasArts, or Lucasfilm game titles going into PS Plus Premium with the PS1 and PSP stuff, and they just kept coming up over and over and over again because it was clear that as a publisher they were okay with letting all these games go through this program, but it's like we saw a lot of those, and now PS2, the floodgates are open, which means, that means we're going to see a lot more of this stuff again for PlayStation 2. So there's that part of it, but also we know Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is coming to PS5 this spring, but I guess in the meantime, you can play this sort of late life cycle PS2 game that I would assume not a lot of people have had the chance to play, but still very appropriate. So only 2 games, kind of a bummer there, and only 9 for Extra, but at least the kind of games are fairly strong. Anyway, moving on to some smaller news stories before getting into our big ones. Let's talk about this. The PS5 disk drive situation is already better, considering last week we talked about how it's been out of stock for a while, especially in the UK, and it's like right after we did that episode, there was a restock in the US and in the UK. I'm not sure how widespread it really is. I think it's still available on PlayStation Direct in the US right now, and it was on Amazon for a little bit, but that sold out very quickly, given people love to order from Amazon. But in the UK, I was hearing a lot of people then say, like, hey, there's been a restock and I just got a drive. So seems like it's better. Now, how much better it really is, I'm not sure we can say just yet, but hopefully some supply is finally coming back in. Moving on to Marvel Rivals, which we can say here, kind of expected. I think this was bound to happen at some point, and now it's happening sooner than we thought, but there is going to be a small little collaboration here with Marvel Spider-Man 2, where the Spider-Man 2 Advanced 2.0 suit is coming to the in-game store on January 30th, the same day the PC version launches as well, so that was pretty cool. And then also just a little PSA here, but the Lunar Remastered collection, which I thought was super cool that this thing was actually confirmed, and it's a real thing because these games are very expensive physically on PlayStation 1, but the collection does have a release date that is going to be April 18th for PS4. Seems like there is only going to be a PS4 version unless there is going to be a native digital PS5 release, but what's pertinent here is that there is going to be a physical copy, and that's going to be available exclusively on Amazon in North America, and then Europe is going to have this through the distributor Clear River Games. So for those physical collectors, you know about Lunar. It's expensive, hard to find, hard to get. If you want it physically in this remastered collection on PS4, it is going to be available very soon. Anyway, another brief news story here is Star Wars Jedi Survivor on PS5 Pro, which, if you remember, this game was not looking too good with the enhancements on that version, and recently Respawn Entertainment sent out a new patch where they openly address the issues by even saying they are now using the latest version of PSSR. So as far as the shimmering issues on the foliage, the reflections on the river, all this stuff should be fixed or addressed on the latest patch. I don't have the game, so I can't boot it and show what it looks like right now, but it would seem as though the issues are fixed, because that was what we thought might have been going on there, is that they were using a very early version of PSSR, which was the case for a few Ubisoft titles. So sounds like this is good, especially given that we are in that growing pain area with PSSR and PS5 Pro, but we do expect over time it will get better and better, and so this issue seems to be fixed so far. Now, moving on to one of our big rumors from this past week, and that is new details for the Gummy Bears project that's in development at PlayStation Studios, where the quick recap here is that this game was an incubation project at Bungie for about 3 years. Then the studio was acquired, multiple layoffs again. At a certain point, PlayStation stepped in. It seems like it was mutually agreed upon that this studio should be, or this team rather, should be spun off into its own separate team under the PlayStation Studios umbrella, and that's kind of where we're at. We do have a brief description of what this game is, which it's like a very colorful MOBA style kind of game that Bungie was very confident in, or at least they thought it was very fun. So we have new details being reported on from the game post, which were then corroborated by Paul Tassi at Forbes, or at least certain details, which those details are that this game apparently incorporates elements inspired by Smash Brothers. Multiple sources with the project say that the players won't have health bars, but instead a percentage-based damage system that then leads to stage knockouts, which it's not a fighting game, but it's still meant to be a team-based MOBA, and the game will be very colorful, attract a younger audience, feature multiple game modes, offer 3 distinct class types, support attack and defense. It's also described as having a lo-fi, cozy aesthetic, and it's a big tonal shift from what Bungie has previously done before, but it's also seen as the studio's most fun project in incubation, and that's why after 3 years the game was spun off into its own studio with around 40 people working on it right now. So it does sound very interesting on paper. I mean, when you think about the percentage-based knockout system, which if you only saw headlines on this, how it's inspired by Smash Brothers, and not knowing the context of it's not a fighting game, it would be easy to make some parallels here from, say, PlayStation All-Stars, which was a mascot brawler that's also colorful, bright, using existing characters, although ironically that title did not have a percentage-based knockout system. But in this case, it's like I'm surprised more studios don't explore that element of Smash further as far as like taking that one part of it, but making the gameplay hook something, well, the base gameplay, I should say, entirely different. At least that's what we're hearing from this game. But yeah, it all sounds very promising on paper. I generally try to be very optimistic, despite how you all know this is not something I would probably be interested in or I'd want to play, just not really a multiplayer person. So something described as a MOBA live service title, that's just, I'm kind of checked out immediately. But as far as like the business prospects of a new studio and what this game will end up doing, we'll of course follow it in the PlayStation Studios lineup and see what ends up happening. So it sounds promising. Obviously, that can go very south really fast, as we saw with Concord, where there can be a lot of internal sentiment, but you would hope there is a lot more diligence in place here to make sure that something like that doesn't happen. And with a new IP going into a very saturated market, it's going to be very tough no matter what this game ends up being, but we will follow it very closely and see what happens. Moving on to some more updates for PlayStation Studios, or in this case, a PlayStation Studios game from an external partner, and that is Kojima Productions, where Death Stranding 2 on the Beach is expected this year. And we recently heard from Kojima on Twitter that they are now in crunch time. So he said, and I quote here, "The most demanding period of game development, both physically and mentally, commonly known as crunch time. On top of mixing and Japanese voice recording, there's an inevitable pile of other tasks, writing comments, explanations, essays, interviews, discussions, and non-game related work. It's incredibly tough." They are indeed in that arduous period of making sure this game comes out on time, which hopefully they're not in a really tough spot as far as like making sure the game does come out on time, but we are in the release year for this game, so we should be hearing more fairly soon, which I would caution. We have seen with this console cycle that Sony is in a position of, with a lot of titles so far, they don't really ramp up the sort of marketing cycle, news cycle for that game until 2-3 months out from release. So we just saw that with like Spider-Man 2 or even Ragnarok, Forbidden West. These games were getting closer and closer to release, and so there was the curiosity of a possible delay or something, but it really doesn't ramp up until they like know for certain the game is coming out at X, Y, and Z date. So we really have to wait for that before we start I guess having concerns that the game doesn't come out this year, but it sounds like they are very much in that position of closing the game out soon. So that's good, and I'm excited because I loved the first game. It's very weird, bizarre, and I'm sure there's a lot more of that in store for us with the second one. Next up, Phantom Blade Zero, the PS5 and PC game coming out, we think, this year. We had a lot of gameplay show up during Gamescom, which looked very promising. I mean, this was a title that when it was announced 2 years ago, everyone thought, like, man, this looks too good. The animation looks too fluid, and these sequences are just cleaned up in a way that doesn't really seem believable. Very similar to what we saw with Black Myth Wukong, but now with this game, we should be expecting it fairly soon. They're doing a new gameplay deep dive on the 21st, so very soon they'll be showing a completely unedited boss fight, and that should be really interesting to see. There is a lot of eyes on this game in particular, so it shouldn't be too much longer to see more details for it, and because they are saying so much about it in recent months and now coming up, it would seem as though the game is probably going to ship this year, because I don't think they've put a release year on the game technically, but the more they show, there's certain milestones where it kind of tips you off to like, okay, they may be wrapping this thing up, and we could have it by the end of this year. So Phantom Blade Zero, we're going to see more gameplay soon. Now, another hack and slash style game that we can talk about is Lost Soul Aside, because the news here for this China Hero Project PS5 game is that the PSN requirement for the Steam version has been removed. So on the Steam database page, you can see they did recently make this change, and we're not really sure why. And I am puzzled as to why, to be honest, because The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, the Steam page for that, it's on there. Also, Midnight Murder Club, which SI is publishing that third-party game. It's not a PS Studios game or anything. It's just, they have a publishing agreement for that title. And so on PlayStation and the Steam page, the PSN requirement is there. So I'm not entirely sure why they're doing it with this game in particular. Maybe it is going to go back up. In theory, it's great news because that means the game's not going to be barred from 100-plus countries, obviously. But I don't know. It's a very strange thing. And this, too, is a game we should be seeing more info about within the coming months. So I don't know. I'm at a loss for words as to why, unless they really they have some sort of telemetry suggesting this game needs to be as widely available as it could possibly be. Maybe it's, contingent on some sort of deal previously made through the China Hero program. Who knows? But for whatever reason, the PSN requirement was removed for this game. Moving on to our big PlayStation Studios update coming from Jason Schreier writing for Bloomberg. This was confirmed by a Sony spokesperson speaking with Bloomberg, but Sony has canceled 2 more live service games, one from Bend Studio, another from Bluepoint Games. Now, we do know the studios are not closed, and the spokesperson did provide the quote here where they say, Bend and Bluepoint are highly accomplished teams who are valued members of the PlayStation Studios family, and we are working closely with each studio to determine what are the next projects. Now, Jason did also confirm that for Bluepoint, they were working on God of War Ragnarok from 2020 to 2022, but after that, it was a God of War live service game. So that's what Bluepoint was doing after the Ragnarok support, which we touched on in our recent productions video, because it was like they're mostly in the support role for Ragnarok for a long time. After that, it's like, what are they doing now? A lot of speculation was maybe they were doing like a God of War spin-off title or something, some kind of an existing property, but it's original content to them, and that's why the language surrounding Bluepoint was always very particular, and that's also why my prediction I thought was now wrong, but it's like, oh, maybe they moved on to like just supporting their new IP, because again, Bluepoint does not have like a narrative director, creative director, game director. They don't have these roles that fill out leading their own project from the ground up entirely, per se. So it would be collaborative in some way, and that would make sense with, say, the God of War property. But having it be live service, I think, was very surprising. So before we talk about that, there's also Bend, which for Bend we did know for a long time. Mid-2022, so about 2 years is when they kicked up this newer IP. They already talked about this on the PS blog, which was a multiplayer AAA live service. Well, they didn't say live service at the time, but just a AAA new IP based on the open world systems they established in Days Gone. That was the language around the time, and we kind of assumed it probably would have live service elements to a degree, because that's kind of where the company is right now. But with Bend, it's always important to clarify generally it's important to clarify the studios do have a lot of agency as far as like what they want to do. They can always sort of decide internally to pitch ideas and make vertical slices, and from there pitch those to Sony. So we never actually know if they were put on something to a degree. I know a lot of people like to always masquerade that around as if the studios were forced to do X, Y, and Z game or something. So it's really important to always clarify that. But that's what's going on with Bend and Bluepoint. So first things first, I guess the good news, if we can say that, they're not shut down, right? That is good news. Geographically, that's probably playing a very big role here. Bluepoint is in Austin, Texas, but Bend being in Oregon, that probably plays a very big part in them not being shut down versus, say, their studios in California. There's a lot more pressure for those studios to deliver versus these two, but I'm sure that's playing a role. I mean, that is the good news. The bad news is like everything else, obviously. I mean, it's brutal, man. It's sort of dialing back to previous conversations about the live service thing, right? Which is, as far as how Sony's been approaching it, they've put a lot of new capital into live service projects. So they're still doing single player experiences, obviously, but picking up different studios or partnering up with different studios. And that's where a lot of the live service stuff has been, In this case, I mean, obviously it stings because Bluepoint, a lot of fans were thinking that it was going to be single player. I thought it was going to be them just continuing to partner with Santa Monica, which kind of in the same way is like, oh, we're not getting a new separate single player game from them specifically. This is just so puzzling though. Like I'm looking at this news. I'm like, what? Like God of War live service? Like sure, they want to leverage IP and they're investing in live service, and we know they had 12 plus games, which now more than half I think are shut down at this point. But it's like, I don't know what the thought process was there, especially Bluepoint too. I mean, yeah, they were working on Ragnarok for 2 years, and that's them sort of earning their stripes with working on that IP. But like, they're not a big team, and they still, as far as I know, did not have a creative director. Game director, all these roles that sort of fill out something from the ground up, as I mentioned before. And live service is just so big, and you need a lot of resources and a very big team once you're scaling up to then support that game. I don't know what was the end game on that, right? Like, okay, we have like, because I know some would mention like, oh, God of War Ascension. But that was like back when it was more arena style and much, much smaller in scope. So maybe that's an idea of how you can see where they would take it, but it's still questionable at best. So I don't know what the thought process was there. Bluepoint is a very talented team. We know they can make amazing things, and going back to the agency and having their own decisions, they want it to move on from ports, remakes, remasters, and start doing original works. It's just, I really didn't think it would be that. That one is absolutely puzzling to me. I don't even know how that came about and what the end game, what the plan was there for scaling up in that way. So there's that. Bend, we already had an idea of exactly what they were doing. So, I mean, to be disappointed is an understatement, just in that for them, the clock on them is, they're so far behind, right? Because they shipped Days Gone in 2019. They had a lot of turbulent stuff going on with the kind of projects they were working on up until finally being able to do a new IP. And that's good. I always want to see them do new IP. But it's like that was 2019, so the clock for them is so much further back, right? So it's really tough to look at this and not call it a disaster, because it obviously is for these two, and it just compounds, obviously, with what has been a lot of live service failures. But this is sort of what we were getting at before. There's definitely two ways to approach this. For a lot of folks, they're in more of the negative camp. I try to generally be more half full here. The thing for me has always been like, what's the lesser of two evils, which is, do you make 12 plus live service games? They all take 5 to 6, 7, 8 years to make. It's a lot of time, money, and resources, and they come out and 11 of them fail. One ends up doing good. Like that would be your Helldivers 2, or technically 2 if you want to, 2 or 3 if you want to start counting Gran Turismo 7 and MLB The Show, which Sony does. But do you want 10 games to come out and fail and do awful, or which happens in the games business, is you cut your losses. So financially speaking, that's what they do. They step in after 1-2 years, do a portfolio review, and if the team is not reaching certain milestones, that's when they come in, shut down the project. I mean, we could easily point at Concord and say that's what's going on here, but the thing is, even prior to Concord, we had the Bungie acquisition, them integrating into PS Studios. where they were meant to do a portfolio review and provide expertise, it's like, well, sure, they did that, but also Sony now has the financials of what goes into such a big live service team like Bungie, which on their own, they were like lying about financials and they were not in a good spot. So there's that aspect, which around the time when that happened and then bringing in Bungie, that was late 2023 where they canceled a number of projects like Last of Us Online, Twisted Metal. So they've already been in this place of they're learning and they're figuring out like, whoa, live service is insanely expensive, hard to break into, and this is them course correcting. It sucks. This is awful news. The Bluepoint thing is just so puzzling to me. I don't know why you don't just like look at that team and you know, obviously if they want to do creative works, original works, let them go off and do that. But I don't know what the thought process was there for God of War. They must have been working with like another team. It must have been Santa Monica, right? Like I just don't know where that would have gone, but that's just sort of where my head is at with this news being hot off the presses. But you know, the half full thing is like they're course correcting. So I know it sucks. It's been terrible. The clock is reset on two fantastic studios that, yes, are not going anywhere, but, you know, we're more than halfway into the PlayStation 5 life cycle. So it's going to be how much longer to see something from Bluepoint and Bend Studio. They are creative, talented teams that can put out good stuff. But, you know, with the live service thing, that's been taking a long time, and now Sony realizing that it's really tough and they're cutting losses on all these projects. And with how long it takes for games to make, like, it's no surprise as to why Sony has been spending a lot of time looking outside of their first-party banner and partnering up with studios and securing exclusivity and publishing other titles, arguably a little bit more than what we saw in prior generations, because they always did these things, but it's just, yeah, it's a disaster. It sucks. It really does suck. Especially because these are two teams where arguably it does impede on single player. I'll always make the case. It's like they were acquiring outside studios. They were partnering up with outside studios. A lot of what the live service push has been was navigating it, and what I still feel was like maybe the appropriate way to do it if you're trying to juggle live service and single player, which is don't cut into your single player resources, invest more money, which they did, into new studios, which they did. The terrible part is that like Naughty Dog was the first one where it's like, oh man, like they actually were a single player studio that were tied up on Last of Us Online for a very long time, and so that was a lot of money and 4+ years that were down the drain basically on that project. Bluepoint is now one of them. Arguably you could say that for Bend, and again with outside studios you could still make the case all that money should have been put on single player, but you know, that's kind of where we're at, right? There's a very poor way to look at it. There's a slightly nice way to look at it, which is them course correcting. Ideally, you'd want them to do this sooner rather than later. So that's where we're at. It's not a great day for PlayStation, I'll tell you that much. It's just going to be a long time now for a lot of these games and these studios to start shipping on what is likely going to be PlayStation 5 late life cycle and PlayStation 6. But you would also maybe think that Sony is in a position where they are still going to do live service. We know there's still a handful of titles out of those 12, more so now, that are still going to end up releasing probably. But they just are going to be a lot more careful about what games go over that finish line and not investing that much further. And in some cases, maybe letting some of these teams, like your Bluepoint or your Bend, to maybe go back to single player. If that is the case for these particular studios, we already have that outcome for Naughty Dog, which is they're going back to single player. The outside partnerships, maybe they'll still explore it that way, but yeah, it's pretty rough. I mean, one could probably argue, right, because everyone likes to look at leadership too. It's like, oh, you know, Jim Ryan, a lot of this falls on him, which surely a lot of it does, and he's gone now, but Herman Hulst, once he took over PlayStation Studios as the head and now the CEO of the studio's business group, you know, one could argue that this is him hopefully course correcting. I'd like to think that's what's happening here for what has been really rough and losing a lot of money and canceling projects, right? Because I've always had this sort of pragmatic approach of like, at least they're sort of navigating it in a way that's not going to impede on single player as much as people like to think it is. But, you know, it's hard to deny Bluepoint and Naughty Dog in that position, and again, arguably Bend as well. And when it takes so long to make games, yeah, it's even worse when, like, even the single-player stuff takes forever. Now, these titles or these studios are reset. So I think we're just sort of rambling, but I think you get the point. So that's what's going on for these teams. We'll keep watching very closely and see what happens, but yeah, Bluepoint was puzzling. I don't know what I'd love to learn more about what went on with that. All right, moving on to some very delectable PlayStation rumors, starting off with this one, which is a possible state of play in February, which very important to clarify the source on this one, because one big thing that happened yesterday was Nintendo finally making a formal announcement for the Switch 2. That's its name. They showed the hardware. It's finally out there, which I'm sure a lot of you probably followed that whole thing building up to it. It was kind of insane with how many leaks and, he said, she said going on, and accessory makers, and then 3D prints, and just so much stuff building up to Nintendo finally revealing it. But the thing is, we did know that announcement was going to take place yesterday, courtesy of Nate the Hate, where he's got his own channel, shows up on the Spawncast occasionally. Very nice guy. He's also very private, but he is the kind of person where generally when he does talk about things, he has been privy to some business dealings and things going on in the games business. So typically, if he says something, he probably has a good idea of it ending up being true. And so in this case, he was the first person to mention it would be a hardware-focused announcement for Switch 2 on Thursday. That did happen. Even prior to that happening, I will say Nate has had a very good track record. So having said that, he is the source of this rumor for a state of play in February, where somebody asked on Twitter straight up, how about the next state of play? You know anything that's going on there? And so he did respond with, how's February sound? Which that does track too. I mean, we had a state of play late January 2024, and then prior to that was like mid or late February 2023. So honestly, like, we had CES kind of come and go, but it's like we don't really have to wait that long for Sony to probably hold another state of play presentation fairly soon, and this should be a fairly busy year. We should be expecting a number of announcements, which will have the February one presumably, and then likely another one in like late May, right before that sort of not E3 SGF timeframe. But yeah, we do have some idea of possibly expecting another state of play. Now, another rumor coming from Nate the Hate, which this one also predates the Switch 2 thing, but it was discussing Xbox games releasing on PlayStation. We're still in this position of, yeah, we've got more announcements that are already confirmed, but that's still sort of the third-party stuff that we previously sort of expected could be a possibility, like Doom the Dark Ages, The Outer Worlds 2 with Indiana Jones. We know that deal was amended, but now it's coming to PS5 later this spring. But we still have not really had sort of well-known Xbox staples show up on PlayStation just yet. But recently, Nate discussed on his channel a video going over, Xbox predictions in 2025. He mentioned that he's heard Halo the Master Chief Collection and Flight Simulator will be coming over to both PS5 and Switch 2. And also this rumored Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion remake. These should all be due either this year or beyond, which after this news broke out, we then had Jez Corden writing for Windows Central, not only corroborating this info, but he's saying that more is on the way too, which includes Gears of War Ultimate Edition, Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, and Age of Mythology, which on the flip side of this, he did also mention that he's predicting Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth will finally make the jump over to Xbox and Switch 2 as well, which 7 Remake should be this year on Xbox, and then 2026 would be Rebirth, and really depends on how that lines up for Switch 2. But yeah, we never knew the conditions of that deal. Obviously, we've said before, like, we know Sony initially amended the agreement with 7 Remake on PS4 and then extending with Intergrade because the game after 2-3 years never came out on Xbox. So but it seems like Square is finally going to get there, and hopefully they'll find a bigger audience on Xbox, and more so Nintendo in this case. But yeah, the Xbox thing, I mean, it's as we've said before, I'm sure this will happen eventually. The last big update with this ongoing story for Microsoft and their whole third-party U-turn is that, like, as far as studio resources go, they can't just ship everything overnight, but it's still a matter of, like, is it certain studios that are going to say skip what they have previously done and just new releases from this point onward? Are they going to try and backport more of the older catalog on PlayStation and Nintendo? That's probably where it's a heavy case-by-case basis, especially because we've seen certain previously third-party teams, they were probably much better positioned to do, like, PlayStation and Nintendo releases versus, say, what was previously a more proper Xbox Game Studios developer that didn't have PS5 dev kits until maybe recently, not working on that hardware, not having a workflow with doing multi-plat releases. But, either way, we just haven't seen such a well-known Xbox property release on PlayStation just yet, that being your Gears and Halo, Forza, even Flight Simulator. So the Master Chief Collection would make the most sense if they're going to do Halo, because that's so many games packaged neatly together, and that's a great way for PlayStation fans to get familiar with that franchise. But man, that would just be, it'll be such a weird thing to see, because it really is such a historic thing we've seen unfold for the past year and a half or so, which is Microsoft openly now becoming a big third-party publisher. It's very much a Sega moment, even though they are in the here and now still invested in shipping hardware. But it seems like we're maybe not that far away from seeing those familiar Xbox IP debut on PlayStation and also Nintendo. Moving on to some patents that Sony recently filed back in 2023, but they were published this week, so now we can see them publicly. And these are always fun to look at because like 85 and 90% of them are so ridiculous and they're probably not going to happen. But there is like a 10% portion here that is plausible and it could show up in, say, future hardware. So one of those cases, I would argue, is this one for, it's called Timed Input Action Release. It's a machine learning model that tries to predict player input. Very similar to what Stadia had, so basically it would use AI to try and predict the player input and reduce latency in certain environments where it's, you're playing an online game, or in some cases when you're streaming. So the Stadia example there, it is something that works fundamentally, and it could be really deployed in a real world environment. So that's something I could see happen. I mean, with PlayStation 6 not that far away, like, we do have to think about certain key pillars that console is going to have, and ML is likely going to play a very big part of it. One ridiculous patent that we saw was this diagram showing somebody holding a DualSense sideways in order to mimic the way that you would hold and fire a gun. Super goofy. That's one of those things where it's like, okay, what are we really doing here? What kind of accessory or thing are you trying to draft up? So that looked really, really silly. One where I'm like, honestly, 50-50 on this, but it's one where basically the controller microphone would be able to detect if a player is getting mad or frustrated, and from there they would then give you a game tip or game help. On PS5 as an example, it would maybe make a notification or a suggestion based on hearing somebody just like mother F their game as they're playing it. So that's one where I'm like, oh man, like I could see it. Probably not going to happen, but I don't know. I could see it. There's just so many silly ones that we could discuss, but the ML one for input and delayed predictive things that could happen when you're playing games to reduce latency, yeah, I would be not surprised at all if we see that happen. Moving on to the ever-lovable Shuhei Yoshida, where after 31 years, we all knew this day was coming, but he has officially left PlayStation. There was a big going-away party, a lot of love and support being sent his way. What's funny is that right after we did find out he has at least one new gig in his post-PlayStation life, which he's voice acting in Promise Mascot Agency, which is hilarious. I'm sure that's probably not what he's doing long-term, but he is doing that. And he also immediately after went on Kinda Funny and talked with Greg Miller for like hour, 2 hours. It was a very long conversation, a very fun conversation too. Obviously they're pals, they go way back, and so it was a pretty long convo talking about PlayStation history and Shuhei's time at the company and things like that. But we also, of course, naturally had a lot of things that were more interesting than others that we'll discuss as news stories here. So one thing he was asked about is what fans sometimes get wrong about the games business or what goes into making games. And so Shuhei did openly talk about remasters and ports. He said, he feels like Herman gets criticized for, Herman Hulst, mind you, gets criticized for doing a lot of remasters. But Shuhei, as we've probably discussed on this channel many times, but it's a matter of like remasters and ports, those don't necessarily take up the kind of resources people think that they do. They're usually separate teams that are usually just as a way to either train new staff or they're meant to fund new projects, and they just don't really take away from doing new things. And that's always been how Shuhei has understood it, because he led the first party teams for a very long time for his career up until he then led the indie initiative. But, it's one of those things where, like, right after he leaves, he just openly acknowledges something that has always been well documented as far as, like, why remasters and ports are such a common thing nowadays. Oftentimes you need to buy or support those, not you personally, but the company needs those games to be bought and played by newer audiences to expose the IP to new people and just generate revenue for the next thing that they can do, because games are so expensive nowadays. So he said that's the one thing that a lot of people tend to misunderstand about the games business right now. Another question Shuhei was asked was, what one game do you think you were surprised by as far as sales? Like, what were you surprised did not do as well as you thought it would? And he said Horizon Forbidden West, where he loved Zero Dawn, thought it was fantastic, and so for Forbidden West, where the game was bigger and better, he was surprised that did not sell as many units as it did. Which, this is one of those things where I'm surprised by that answer, if only because of the context of Forbidden West. Because there's so many, like, PlayStation IP, and I'm like, he really chose that one. This has got to be why the company, like, doesn't do as many interviews as they used to nowadays, or when they do interviews, and this was, like, always the case normally, but, like, they don't do off-the-cuff stuff. Like, almost always, it's very curated as far as what you can ask, and then the answer that you're probably going to receive. Like, they used to do so many very casual talks, like with Greg back during those days, right? And now Shuhei is free to kind of say whatever. And it's like, they probably would not want him to say that, because, like, this game has just this reputation, or this franchise rather, that it's not big or that people don't enjoy it. I'm just so tired of hearing about it, because obviously I'm a fan of the franchise, sure, but, like, the numbers are always there, even in this case, which is the weird thing to me, because Zero Dawn, right? Lifetime sales, yeah, it's a lot. It's like 24 million for Zero Dawn, and that's up to May 2023. But, the first year the game came out, it was like 7.6, 7.7. It was like 7 million something copies in the first year. Now, Forbidden West sold 8.3 million that was like a little after a year after the game came out, like April 2023. And it was February of that year where the game went on PS Plus Extra, and we saw from the Insomniac breach, like, that was very much an experiment to see what would happen, and that's why the game sales fell off a cliff, basically. But technically speaking, like, launch-aligned, Forbidden West sold faster, so we don't know necessarily how well Forbidden West would have done long-term, because we'll never have that timeline anymore. The game went on Extra, therefore a lot of people were able to play the game that way, so it's not even going to so much as humor the idea of reaching Zero Dawn's lifetime sales, but maybe that's what he was getting at. I don't really know. So it's like, I'm surprised by that answer. I feel like there's so many other things that he maybe would have been surprised by, unless he personally really thought that game was just going to do, like, absolute gangbusters. I don't know, but it sucks to have him say that, because it's like, we all know where that's going to go, how people are going to use that as bait and this sort of ammo to claim that Horizon is a bad franchise, or that people don't like it. I mean, obviously people are allowed to not like it, but I still find that the franchise is big, and it has earned its stripes, basically. Now, something else that naturally came up is PlayStation Vita. What went wrong? Why did it fail? I cannot believe it's only a day after he leaves the company that we're now getting this talk, but he does openly say that, yes, we as a company made several technical decisions that were not good ones. So he does admit proprietary memory cards were a mistake. Back touch was also not necessary and added cost to the hardware. Same with the OLED. It was beautiful, but it was expensive. And also the video out capability, which they could do. It was on dev kits. It was possible, but they removed that from the retail unit to save a few cents, which economies of scale, that's, kind of how that works, but it would have been way more money long term. He did say, however, the biggest reason that he feels personally is that they did not have the resources for studios to support two different platforms, which he talks about Nintendo in this way, where they consolidated to just the Switch. And it's something we talk about all the time, which is why modern PlayStation, if they do another portable, it has to be an existing ecosystem. The Switch, he even talks about how Nintendo historically has always been in the spot where, like, only one platform is doing really well and not the others. Just for them, it's kind of inverse, where, like, home console is not nearly as well as their portables, and then their teams have to be spread thin across all those games and do partnerships with external studios. And so so it's just a different way to manage platforms, and so Sony had the same difficulties. I still find with Vita, right, because like it's the thing people love to shout immediately is the memory cards, proprietary memory cards. We all know why they did it, and it was probably still maybe the right decision at the time for that one element of Vita, because they were leaving the PSP, which had a lot of piracy. But you know, I'm always of the mind where it's like that is, yeah, it sucked. It was cost prohibitive, but it's like that compounded on all these other things and also market conditions. I still find that, you know, if you let the thing use Memory Stick Pro Duo or even SD cards, it's not going to sell another 60, 70 million units. I find that to be kind of ridiculous. You need a lot more things that all come together to make the platform do well, and it was just in a very low point as far as the market goes for portables. So we all know where that eventually led to, which is the Switch, Steam Deck, things like that, existing ecosystems. I really find that, like, yeah, I think the back touch was more of a waste because it's just such a silly thing that hardly any games used. And it's like, just throw L2, R2 on there and just, I don't know. There's so many, I could talk for so long about Vita, but it's just nice to have this kind of conversation out there from somebody internally that can start saying these things. I'm sure a lot more folks at Sony also felt the same way throughout the entirety of it, but mistakes were made, and the system just was not meant to be. Now, finally, we also get a very candid answer about Bloodborne, which Shu does clarify he's not at liberty to say anything about first-party teams, which is obvious, but more so he says he doesn't know what they're up to anyway, which I do believe, because even though he's like, you know, so well known at the company and he used to manage those teams, sometimes big organizations, a lot of them will be very segmented with these departments, so I actually think he probably doesn't really know a whole lot about what's going on right now, but either way, he's not going to reveal that. But the point is, his answer personally, he feels that it's something where Miyazaki, he said before, he really loves Bloodborne, but he's also very successful and so busy, so he probably wants to do something with the game, but he doesn't want anybody else to touch it, and so the PlayStation team wants to respect that. That's what Shu thinks is going on. And it's been, you know, proposed before that maybe that is the situation. Sony does own the IP, but, you know, in theory, they could just be respecting From's wishes, or maybe it's contractuals and they're not even allowed to do anything with the game unless it's From Software that works on it, oversees it, or whatever the case might be, contingent on whatever sort of deal they have with that game in that studio. Who knows? Because clearly it is the kind of IP and game where at this point in time, they could do something with it, whether it's a basic port, remaster. Not sure if a full-blown remake is really in order here. People would be very happy with a basic patch on the PS4 version to unlock the frame rate. But that's the answer. I mean, the thing is, like, I guess that probably is what's going on. I mean, the company does want to make lots of money, so surely they would want to monetize the game. I think getting a patch just to unlock the frame rate, which we know is very, very possible, that's not on the cards here. So as far as finding a sort of opening to maybe monetize the game and port it, or do like a PlayStation 6 day one release similar to Demon's Souls, I don't know. It's always been very puzzling and silly, but Shu's answer does sort of track, at least with, you know, how have they not done it by now? Well, it probably is a little bit of what Shu's inferring right here. It has to be From that touches the game, and they're not really in a position to do it nowadays, and maybe they don't want to ruin that relationship that they have with From by, you know, taking the IP that they own and doing something else with it, right? It maybe is in a position of they really do respect the property and want to make sure that it's done correctly. Moving on to one news story for PlayStation Productions, which is the Until Dawn movie, because we finally have a full-blown trailer so we can see how they're approaching it. And I will admit it's pretty interesting because they're trying to adapt the game's mechanics into a static experience, because the game, obviously, you make choices based on who lives or dies, or that determines who lives or dies, and you got to make it until dawn. The movie, the kids go to more of a suburban-looking house, not a cabin, but it seems like they die very early on, then they wake up, and then they are chased again by a different villain. So that is kind of a looping thing they're going through, and they have to figure out how to make it until dawn, and I guess they only get like 13 attempts to figure that out. So it's similar in a way. I will admit it's pretty clever. I guess it would have made more sense if it was the same villain, but maybe that's like way too similar to the plot of, what's that movie called? Happy Death Day or something, that like birthday thing, if you remember what I'm talking about. I don't know, so maybe it's like a little bit too similar to that. I will say, like, in the trailer, you can see one of the villains, not to spoil here if you haven't played Until Dawn, but like in the trailer, there is one villain that is the primary villain of Until Dawn. So like, that's cool. You would assume that one of the villains matches up there. But if that's the premise, I would have more appreciated them not saying that or showing it in the trailer, and approach this like Cabin in the Woods, where all the trailers and press materials make it seem like it's just kids go to a place and die at the hands of one villain, and you don't realize sort of what it becomes later on. So maybe I would have done it that way, but I'm not the marketing person, so who am I to say? But it does seem like it's, you know, more Until Dawn in name and not necessarily exactly what the game was trying to do, but I can appreciate it, and so I probably will actually go see this. I've missed a few of the last PS production things just because there's certain IP I just don't care to really see. But this one, I think I will go and watch it. Now, I would be remiss to not mention this news, but Astrobot so far has been doing very well for Game of the Year awards. The point I always make here is that, you know, your favorite game is probably going to get a Game of the Year award somewhere, but there is always one that sort of really steamrolls the others, and it does seem like Astrobot has gotten a lot of them. Right now, it did get nominated for a few things at the DICE Awards that takes place on February 13th, and so it was nominated for Game of the Year, Family Game of the Year, and then Outstanding Achievement in Animation, Original Music Composition, Technical Achievement, and Game Design. But there are like certain places that track Game of the Year award winners, and so like based on where you see this, you can find that Astrobot has won like more than 200 of them, which is insane. I am so proud and happy for Team Asobi and that game for what is a colorful, bright 3D platformer. It is so encouraging, and so I'm happy to see that. We had to mention that. Astro really has unironically swept. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would love to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel, a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are some of the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was PS5 tips and tricks for power users. We've already done a few tips and tricks videos, but these ones are entirely new, and they might be more useful for somebody that really uses their PlayStation a lot. They're more of an engaged customer, so you can go check that out. And then coming up on Tuesday, probably another upload. We might have an extra Sunday conversation. I know we'll be doing Click R3 very soon, so this coming week probably will be. The following week, I should say, should have a Click R3, and that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.